Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you. Yours truly, Cornelius Vanderbilt. And that quote is the embodiment of the man we're going to talk about today, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Welcome to the Knowledge Project. I'm your host, Shane Parrish. If you want to take your learning to the next level, consider joining our membership program at fs.blog/membership. As a member, you'll get early access to episodes, no ads, including this, exclusive content, hand-edited transcripts, and so much more. Check out the link in the show notes for more. He began as a teenage ferry captain, battling storms in New York Harbor for pennies. From these humble beginnings, he clawed his way to become America's most feared and admired magnate. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't just dominate one industry, he conquered three: ferries, steamships, and railroads. Rivals called him ruthless, passengers called him unstoppable. But Vanderbilt didn't just build businesses, he rewrote the rules, laying the foundation for the modern corporation. This is his story. If you think today's tycoons are tough, wait till you meet the Commodore. Most of the research for this episode came from reading The First Tycoon by T.J. Stiles and Tycoon's War by Stefan Dando Collins. Remember to stick around at the end of the show for my reflections and afterthoughts, as well as the lessons you can learn from Vanderbilt. If you want to read my highlights from Tycoon's War or The First Tycoon, you can sign up below fs.blog/membership. Just look in the description for this podcast, you can find a link. It's time to listen and learn. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only. It's January 4th, 1877. A winter wind cuts through New York City, where a crowd gathers outside the Church of Strangers. Inside, elites await the reading of Cornelius Vanderbilt's will, rumored to be worth $100 million, 1/20th of all U.S. currency. His legendary willpower and ruthless business tactics had forced rivals to pay him to go away. Now, the entire city wants to see how the man who once dominated ferries, steamboats, and railroads chose to dispense his vast fortune. His early life was filled with fistfights, high-speed steamboat duels, engine explosions, and numerous near-death experiences. His latter days with daredevil harness races and high-stakes financial confrontations that even extended to the international scene. By the time of his death, virtually every American had paid tribute to his treasury. They had passed through his Grand Central Depot on 42nd Street, crossed the bridges over the sunken tracks along 4th Avenue, or traveled one of the countless ferries, steamboats, or railroads he had controlled during his 60-year career. Vanderbilt was the precursor to a class of men who would wield power within the state so great that it would rival the state itself. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, Gould, Morgan, all were just beginning their careers when Vanderbilt stood at his zenith. They studied him and they followed his example, though few would match his impact. His admirers called him the finest example of the common man rising through hard work and ability. His critics, on the other hand, called him ruthless, an unelected king who never pretended to rule for his people. But Vanderbilt's significance was more complex, more contradictory than either of his admirers or critics fully grasped. His life spanned from the days of George Washington to those of John D. Rockefeller, from a rural, agricultural, essentially colonial society in which the term businessman was unknown to a corporate industrial economy that would define America's future. Vanderbilt didn't just experience that changing time period and watch as the American economy rose around him. He was possibly the largest force at the time responsible for the building of it. He was the trailblazer in the corporate world and reimagined what a corporation could do. Now, to truly understand the Commodore and that world, we must go back to the beginning, to Staten Island, May 27th, 1794. when Phoebe Vanderbilt gave birth to her fourth child, naming him Cornelius after his father, though they called the boy Cornell. The Vanderbilts descended from Jean Arsène Vanderbilt, who had come to the New World to farm generations earlier. On Staten Island, most of the original Dutch settlers led an inward-looking rural life. Americans of British descent often viewed them with distaste. As one traveler observed in the 1790s, nothing can exceed the state of indolence and ignorance in which these Dutchmen are described to live. Many of them are supposed to live and die without having been 5 miles from their own houses. But there was one distinctive feature of the rural Dutch that would profoundly shape young Cornelius Vanderbilt. They farmed for profit. While many English-speaking farmers in the region devoted much of their efforts to subsistence, Dutch farming was market-oriented and derived its distinct characteristics from Dutch tradition. The rural Dutch shared the commercial consciousness of their urban brethren. They clattered their wagons into Albany, New Brunswick, and New York to sell their produce with a savvy that became their custom. When a cobbler refused to return a man's shoes until he made full payment, the frustrated customer wrote in his diary, "He is too Dutch by half." Young Cornelius was born into this tradition of commerce. His parents created a household where, far earlier than in remote communities, the marketplace strode right through the door every day. While farmers living up the Hudson may make just one delivery of crops to riverside merchants in an entire year at harvest time, the Vanderbilt house pulsed constantly with buying and selling, borrowing and lending, earnings and debt. Cornelius's father had built or bought a pirogue, a specialized two-masted vessel deployed by the Dutch for trading, and began ferrying neighbors and their produce along the bay in Manhattan. Phoebe, Cornelius's mother, was equally entrepreneurial. She was not only the family oracle, one 19th century writer declared, she was the oracle of the neighborhood, whose advice was sought in all sorts of dilemmas and whose judgment had weight. Court records show she lent money at commercial rates of interest and once even foreclosed on a widow's mortgage, the widow being her own daughter. Unlike most farmers, they actually lived within sight of New York City, where from their Staten Island home, they could literally see the mass of ships in the harbor bringing goods and ideas from around the world. The United States that Cornelius was born into was a very young nation. Keep in mind that when Vanderbilt was born, George Washington was still early in his second term of the presidency. Only 5 cities held more than 10,000 residents at this time, and the percentage of the nation's 4 million citizens who lived in towns of at least 2,500 people languished in the single digits and would linger there for decades to come. Most Americans lived scattered along the Atlantic coast, with only the bravest pioneers venturing west to the Appalachians. By his early teens, Vanderbilt was totally drawn to the water, leaving the fields behind. Accounts on this vary, but by the age of 16, he was running his own ferry that was either owned by his parents or one that he purchased with a loan from them, promising to help pay the family's $1,000 mortgage. His plan to do so? Operate the boat as a ferry between Staten Island and the growing Manhattan. The teenager launched himself into this venture with intensity, charging a shilling each way, 12.5 cents that accumulated with glacial slowness in a vessel that seated just 20 passengers. Vanderbilt discovered in those daily handfuls of silver a hunger for money that would shape his life from then on. What distinguished his small ferry service from the competition was predictability. While other boatmen waited until their crafts filled to their capacity, the teenage entrepreneur introduced something uncommon to the New York harbor, a schedule. His ferry departed at fixed times regardless of the passenger count, a self-imposed discipline that transformed water transit from casual to reliable service, earning him loyalty and repeat business. This was an extension of how he lived his life, with one contemporary at the time saying his life was regulated by self-imposed rules, with a fixedness of purpose as invariable as the sun in its circuit. That reliability for service extended to the winter months as well. When ice choked the harbor, he was often the only ferryman willing to make the crossing. He studied the tides, winds, and currents relentlessly and mastered the natural forces that other boatmen merely accommodated. In simple terms, he worked harder. During the blinding storms, when sleet and snow crashed across the bay, Pearl Street merchants would seek out the gangly teen, trusting him alone to deliver urgent messages to vessels anchored in the harbor, earning Vanderbilt additional income. Not only was he reliable, in these months he was often the only option for passengers. And although there was no recorded earnings from this time, presumably he could charge a premium for his services. In fair weather, it was a different story, and he competed aggressively on price, undercutting established operators as a rule. If other ferrymen charged 18 cents, Vanderbilt would charge 12. If they dropped to 10, he'd go to 8. This approach, price competition to the point of driving out rivals, would become his signature strategy throughout his career, regardless of scale or industry. It's worth pausing here for a second to talk about this. Isidore Sharp, the founder of the Four Seasons, said something that has long struck with me. He said, "Excellence is the capacity to take pain." One of the things that sets Vanderbilt and other outliers apart is their willingness to tolerate pain. Most people have no capacity to endure pain, financial or psychological. And if you can gain a real advantage. It hurt Vanderbilt to cut prices, but it hurt his competitors more, and he knew it. It hurt Vanderbilt to run his service when he couldn't see or the weather was bad, but he knew it hurt his competitors so much they wouldn't even operate. It's hard to compete with someone who can tolerate more pain than you. Okay, back to our story. Within a year, legend has it, the teenage Vanderbilt had not only paid off his loan, but had given his parents several $100s towards their mortgage. And it is here where we see Vanderbilt evolve from just a hard worker into something much more. If his parents had taught him anything, it was that business thrived on relationships. Though his hands grew calloused from twisting wooden tillers, the harbor brought him not just physical strain, but valuable connections. As he accumulated his modest portion of the ferry's earnings through 1810, 1811, and 1812, Vanderbilt made a pivotal decision to purchase shares in other boats, shares whose profits he deliberately kept separate from his family obligations. Vanderbilt transformed himself from a mere laborer, somebody who worked harder than anyone else, into an investor, or to put it plainly, a capitalist. His money was now making money for him, expanding his reach beyond what only his two hands could accomplish in a day's work. As war with Britain loomed and then erupted in 1812, these investments positioned him perfectly to capitalize on the shifting trade patterns. With a British blockade due to the war forcing coastal shipping to route through Staten Island and overland across New Jersey, Vanderbilt's position between Manhattan and Staten Island suddenly became a commercial choke point and one where he could take advantage. By 1813, with war raging and his reputation growing, Vanderbilt took two decisive steps towards independence. First, he commissioned his very own custom-built ferry in New Jersey, funded by his carefully hoarded and growing savings. On Sundays, he would sail up the Passac River to inspect the boat's progress, accompanied by his cousin, Sophia Johnson, the woman who would become both his bride and his business partner in his life's enterprise. The boat represented his commercial ambitions, while the marriage his declaration of financial independence from his parents who had claimed a share of his earnings since childhood. On December 19, 1813, the now 19-year-old Cornelius married Sophia and moved into a small house near the ferry dock. This wasn't merely a personal milestone, but a commercial one, the final step in his evolution from wage-earning boatman to an entrepreneurial force. By his early 20s, he had expanded from a single ferry to multiple, including larger schooners used for coastal shipping. The locals no longer called him Cornelius. He was now widely known as Captain Vanderbilt. The War of 1812 accelerated Vanderbilt's rise. With military necessity came opportunity. In 1814, as the United States stood on the brink of defeat with Washington captured and New York bracing for an attack, one account says that Vanderbilt secured a lucrative military contract to carry supplies to the city's defensive fortifications. When asked why he won the bid despite not offering the lowest price, the military officer's response crystallized Vanderbilt's growing reputation. "Don't you know why we have given the contract to you? It's because we want this business done and we know you'll do it." Following the war's end in 1815, Vanderbilt made a strategic decision that revealed his commercial instincts. He moved his young wife from Staten Island to 93 Broad Street in Manhattan, settling into an artisan's boarding house. The relocation placed him deliberately at the center of commerce and information, where newspapers published shipping schedules and commodity prices, where auctions and exchanges operated daily, and where reputations, the true currency of business in that era, were established or broken. At his new home in Manhattan, Vanderbilt studied the city's other merchants carefully. He noted that despite the energy and innovations of artisans and small businessmen, New York's wealthiest citizens were primarily general merchants who traded in international cargoes of all types. When the government needed to sell war bonds, it turned to merchant financiers like John Astor. Vanderbilt internalized this lesson, realizing that the wealth he desired would require him to trade in cargoes and not just provide its transportation. He would have to expand. With the war over, New York erupted in commercial activity, and Vanderbilt jumped in with both feet. His approach showed both boldness and shrewdness. Rather than remaining in the familiar harbor waters, the now 20-year-old entrepreneur reached out to distant ports along the Atlantic coast. More importantly, he began seeking partners with greater expertise and capital than he had. He joined forces with his brother-in-law, John DeForest, an experienced mariner who commanded the schooner Charlotte. Vanderbilt purchased a share in this vessel, using it to transport goods between New York and the southern ports, before eventually buying full ownership. Vanderbilt also partnered with his father and others to finance even larger ferries suitable for open water. These vessels cost approximately $750 each. With a small but growing fleet, Vanderbilt aggressively began seeking out market opportunities. He raced competitors to Virginia's oyster grounds, sailed up the Delaware River to purchase shad, and ventured up to New Jersey's Raritan River, hiring horsemen to spread word of his available fish. His commercial operations extended to paying boatmen to meet incoming ships while he negotiated cargo sales on South Street. His business practices here displayed the same forceful determination that characterized his ferry operations. Court records from 1816 and 17 showed that Vanderbilt pursued debts through legal channels, though judges frequently determined he had overstated what was owed. This commercial aggressiveness served him in America's rapidly changing economy. The post-war era brought dramatic transformations to American commerce. Manufacturing, which had developed during wartime isolation, continued expanding. Banking proliferated, especially in New York, and the number of American banks increased from 208 to 246 in 1815 alone, while currency in circulation jumped from 46 to 68 million. Vanderbilt's rise paralleled these developments completely as he sought opportunities in the growing domestic markets. Transportation barriers remained a critical limitation in commerce in early America. In the era before railroads, moving goods 30 miles on land could cost as much as shipping them across the entire Atlantic Ocean. Even coastwise shipping in small schooners had limited capacity. Meanwhile, upriver journeys against currents could take days or prove impossible, and cargoes would often be lost or damaged. The speed of transportation also limited the speed of information and thereby constrained long-distance commerce and financial markets. America needed a transportation revolution, and it was coming. In 1817, New York State began constructing the Erie Canal, which would connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, while steamboats at the same time appeared on the Hudson River, offering transportation independent of wind, muscle, or current. By December 1817, the 23-year-old Vanderbilt had substantial assets now under his command. He was following the path of other successful merchants he had observed. He was a maritime merchant rising through the ranks of America's most vibrant port city and specializing in cargo trading, and he might well have made a fine living as just another successful merchant in Manhattan if it were not for a chance encounter on November 24th, 1817. On that November day, Vanderbilt turned at the sound of his name and saw a well-dressed 60-year-old man looking at him with sharp, hard eyes. The man introduced himself as Thomas Gibbons, a staggeringly rich rice planter from the state of Georgia, now residing in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Empathetic and direct, Gibbons explained that the captain of his steamboat had suddenly left my employ. creating what he called my present embarrassment. He needed someone to take charge of the boat on this day, and I expect for a few days to come. Would Vanderbilt do it? The vessel in question was named Stowdinger, nicknamed the Mouse of the Mountain, or simply Mouse, as it was second-hand and a small craft, smaller at 47 feet than even Vanderbilt's own small boats. But there was one crucial difference between the Mouse and Vanderbilt's own boats. It ran on steam. Vanderbilt understood that the steam engine was the most dramatic technological breakthrough since the printing press. To move on water at will against the wind or current was to transform a fundamental fact of life at this time. A practical education in the steamboat business would be worth more than a few days of taking orders from someone else. The engagement with Gibbons seemed to set him back a step in his own plans, which surprised his friends and acquaintances. Vanderbilt aspired to be more and more, and he was using his own boats to embark on the only obvious voyage to wealth that he could see, setting up as a general merchant. As he stepped aboard the Mouse and inspected its copper boiler, he kept his own boats plying between Staten Island and Manhattan with passengers and produce, while his schooners nosed along coastal waters with cargoes of fish and woolens. But it's clear that he saw the advantages of this new connection. What he did not reckon on was how well he would get on with Gibbons. I always thought Thomas Gibbons a very strong-minded man, the strongest I ever knew, Vanderbilt said later. I don't believe any human could control him. He was the man that could not be led. He could just as easily have been describing himself when he said that. There's another reason that Vanderbilt may have chosen to run a steamboat for a few days, and that was because of the excitement. Running a steamboat at the time would make him the focus of a very interesting legal and business war that was the talk of the waterfront. In 1798, Chancellor Robert Livingston, who was a powerful New York aristocrat, convinced his friends in the legislature to give him a monopoly on steamboat ships in the New York State waters. In 1807, after partnering with inventor Robert Fulton, they launched the first commercially successful steamboat service on the Hudson River. Not only did they have a monopoly, the New York legislature went so far as to give them the right to seize steamboats that entered the New York waters from other states. Enter Thomas Gibbons, the man who would hire Vanderbilt. Cunning and commanding, Gibbons' daughter dryly noted he had a peculiar and singular mode of doing business. Gibbons was, in a word, intense. Perhaps an example will help illustrate this point. Once he became embroiled in a dispute with his neighbor, a man named Aaron Ogden. What began as a fight over a leased pier escalated when Ogden involved himself in Gibbons' ongoing family disputes. Their conflict reached a breaking point when Ogden had Gibbons arrested for an unpaid debt. For Gibbons, this had become an affair of honor, and on July 25, 1816, he stormed over to Ogden's house, horsewhip in hand. He pounded on the door as Ogden ran out the back and scrambled over a fence. Gibbons tacked up a challenge that read, "Sir, I understand that you have interfered in a dispute between Miss Gibbons and myself. My friend, General Dayton, will arrange with you the time and place of our meeting." He later testified in court that if he had found him at home, he meant to have whipped him within an inch of his life in his own house, for he knew he was a coward. Ogden, who had no intention of exchanging shots at dawn, had Gibbons arrested for trespass and for dueling. Gibbons decided to get revenge another way. He would drive Ogden out of the steamboat business. There was just one problem. Ogden had become an ally of the Livingston-Fulton monopoly, receiving a license to operate his steamboat services between New Jersey and New York. Taking on Ogden meant taking on the most powerful monopoly in New York State. When Gibbons launched his steamboat service in defiance of that monopoly, he needed a ship captain who wouldn't back down under pressure. He needed someone with technical skill, physical courage, and a defiant nature. And he found that man in Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt who stepped aboard the Mouse that November day was walking into a fight bigger than himself, which is saying something because he was a very big man. The Livingston-Fulton monopoly represented the old economic order. It was a system where political power and economic privilege were inextricably linked. What began as a temporary job for a few days quickly became a permanent position as Gibbons recognized Vanderbilt's exceptional abilities. Vanderbilt quickly mastered the technical aspects of steam, but more importantly, he shared Gibbons' combative nature and willingness to challenge authority. Indeed, the authority that he was challenging was the remnants of what might have been the last aristocratic generation in America, one that felt it in their inherited privilege to give themselves state-granted monopolies as they saw fit. The monopoly holders did not take this challenge from Gibbons and his steamboat captain lightly. They used every legal maneuver at their disposal to shut down the operation. They had Vanderbilt arrested repeatedly. They tried to seize the mouse, and they even attempted to bribe him to abandon Gibbons. But Vanderbilt remained loyal to Gibbons, partly because of their shared temperament, but also because he recognized the larger principle that was at stake. The monopoly wasn't just unfair to competitors and customers, it was slowing the very adoption of steam technology that could revolutionize transportation for everyone. Vanderbilt had grown up in a market-oriented world and represented the new individualistic American citizen, one that was not guided by honor and respecting others' rights to a legal monopoly. When Ogden's men physically blocked Vanderbilt from docking in New York, he responded in kind, and as Gibbons' case against the monopoly wound its way through the courts, Vanderbilt took charge of the fight on the water. He developed a reputation for daring and ingenuity. When monopoly agents came to arrest him, he would sometimes hide in the ship's engine room. Other times he would simply outrun them, pushing the steamboat's engines to their limits and relishing the fight. The legal battle culminated in a landmark Supreme Court case called Gibbons versus Ogden. And remember, this just started as a neighborly dispute, and now we're in the Supreme Court. In 1824, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in Gibbons' favor, striking down the New York steamboat monopoly. The decision established that the federal Congress alone had the power to regulate interstate commerce. This ruling affirmed that the federal government has the authority to regulate interstate commerce and put a limit on state authority. The steamboat monopoly was dead. Vanderbilt and Gibbons had won. The victory, however, came with a tragic footnote. Gibbons, Vanderbilt's cantankerous mentor, died shortly after the ruling, leaving Vanderbilt at a crossroads. Would he remain to manage Gibbons' steamboat line for his heirs, or would he strike out on his own? After working for Gibbons' son and heir William for a few years, Vanderbilt decided his apprenticeship was over in 1829. He had mastered steam navigation, knew the business inside and out, and earned a reputation as one of the country's top steamboat operators. But it was time to become his own master again. Launching his first independent steamboat venture on the busy New York-Philadelphia route, he went head-to-head with his former employers. He named his vessel, fittingly, the Independence. Vanderbilt's business model was straightforward, echoing his teenage ferry days. Better service, lower prices. He cut fares dramatically from $3 to just $1, forcing rivals to match or lose customers. By upgrading food and accommodations and running on razor-thin margins others couldn't sustain, Vanderbilt gained an upper hand. He practically lived aboard his boats, rarely seeing his wife and family, fully committed to his ambitious vision. Critics accused him of ruinous competition and cutthroat capitalism. The New York Times later described Vanderbilt, accusing him of pursuing competition for competition's sake. During this era, many companies still operated under the unspoken code of respecting each other's territory. But Vanderbilt ignored this tradition entirely. Passengers eagerly flocked to his boats, attracted by his unbeatable fares and dependable service. Competitors, however, struggled to grasp his simple but revolutionary insight. Increased volume could more than offset slim or even negative profit margins. By drastically reducing prices, Vanderbilt significantly boosted demand, a phenomenon economists now recognize as Jevons paradox, where improved efficiency and reduced costs lead to greater overall consumption. And we're going to get into this a little later, but here's a little foreshadowing for you. He would often get paid not to compete. So when I say he's operating at negative profit margins, it sounds like, well, that doesn't work. But in effect, what would happen is he does get paid not to compete. So it does work. Travel time between New York and Philadelphia shrank dramatically to just 10 hours, driven by Vanderbilt's obsession with speed. This didn't merely make the trip affordable, it made it exciting. What began as basic transportation soon transformed into theatrical spectacle. The waters of Raritan Bay became an arena. Its steamboats, the gladiators, and the passengers saw themselves not just as travelers, but as active participants in a thrilling competition that embodied the spirit of the age. They didn't merely seek passage, they craved victory, and Vanderbilt was determined to deliver. Vanderbilt's ship, the Thistle, sliced through the waters aggressively, mirroring its captain's relentless spirit. To Vanderbilt, this battle wasn't solely about profit or winning, it was about domination. This competitive drive defined Vanderbilt's character. Historical author Stephen Dando Collins notes that Vanderbilt was driven by two things: making money and winning. He had an insatiable thirst for conquest, often temporarily sacrificing profit to achieve victory. Once he triumphed, though, Vanderbilt rarely lingered. Instead, he swiftly sought out his next challenge. A more modern parallel to Vanderbilt's relentless competitiveness can be seen in athletes like Michael Jordan, who famously manufactured slights to fuel his competitive edge. For many, including Vanderbilt, the impossible challenge wasn't a bug, it was the feature. Victory itself was less fulfilling than the next mountain to climb, the next unwinnable fight. The Evening Post observed how the sport arising from boat racing had captured public imagination. The New York-Philadelphia route attracted passionate fans who cheered their champions. English actress Anne Royal described her boats as our heroine, recounting dramatically how the rival vessel drew up alongside somewhat boldly and sometimes had the presumption to run ahead. Her account read less like a travel diary and more like a sports reporter's play-by-play. The races compressed time and space, combining speed, affordability, and spectacle to create new markets. Vanderbilt applied what economists later termed price elasticity of demand, demonstrating that transportation wasn't a fixed need, but one stimulated by accessibility and excitement. As fares dropped, more people traveled, reshaping commerce by enabling merchants to access distant markets rapidly and allowing stock market speculators to profit from faster information flow. Leisure travel expanded, forcing aristocrats to mingle with those who were considered social inferiors at the time. Vanderbilt's competitive success earned him the nickname Commodore, a title usually reserved for naval commanders. The irony wasn't lost on Vanderbilt, who had begun his career challenging monopolies. Now he commanded a fleet himself. Despite his ruthlessness in business, he lived pretty frugally, with tremendous self-control and personal expenditure, but none when pursuing competition and business expansion. The confrontation began dramatically when three angry representatives from the Hudson River Steamboat Association stormed Vanderbilt's office. They accused him of secretly owning the Westchester, a steamboat running the Albany line at a scandalously low fare of $2, undercutting the established $3 price. This powerful association was an alliance between the Hudson River, North River, and Troy steamboat companies, and it had previously paid rival Robert Stevens $80,000 to withdraw from competition for 10 years to secure their monopoly. Vanderbilt recognized this was a dangerous moment. He truthfully insisted that he no longer had ties to the Westchester, and it even declined profitable offers to avoid involvement in any rivalry, but the monopoly leaders didn't believe him. War was inevitable. The ensuing Hudson River rate war exposed a striking contradiction with Vanderbilt. When the monopoly retaliated by targeting one of his own profitable routes, Vanderbilt exploded with fury. In a dramatic public declaration in the New York Evening Post, he positioned his People's Line as a champion against the great triangular monopoly, appealing directly to public support. What Vanderbilt conveniently omitted was his own history of enforcing monopolies without hesitation. Yet, as the underdog, Vanderbilt captivated public imagination. He deployed his ships with the Nimrod and the Champion, slashing fares at first to $1 and then an astonishingly low 50 cents. With relentless intensity, he expanded service, launching aggressive advertising campaigns proclaiming no monopoly and winning public acclaim at every dock. However, when spring thawed the Hudson River after winter, passengers found fares back at $3 and Vanderbilt's ships gone. Years later, a New York Herald investigation revealed he had been paid off by the original monopoly, $100,000 plus an annual $5,000 fee to withdraw. Vanderbilt's brutal but effective strategy became clear: identify lucrative routes, wage devastating fare wars, use anti-monopolistic rhetoric to rally public support and a bit of showmanship, and then demand large payoffs to end the competition. This is something he would repeat over and over again. His focus shifted from steamboats to the promising railroad, a safer and faster connection between New York and Boston, bypassing the notoriously rough seas at Point Judith. Vanderbilt recognized the railroad's potential immediately. later remarking to its chief engineer, "There's nothing like it. The first time I ever traveled on the Stonington, I made up my mind." In 1837, Cornelius Vanderbilt saw an opportunity marking his first significant step into railroads with the financially troubled Stonington Railroad. Saddled with $2.6 million in debt, Vanderbilt realized controlling travel along Long Island Sound required balancing both rail and steamboat operations. At home, Vanderbilt's relationship with his 16-year-old son William was strained by his demanding nature. Frustrated by Billy's passive demeanor, Vanderbilt placed him under Wall Street broker Daniel Drew, forging an uneasy partnership. Drew accepted Billy as a clerk, but demanded a favor in return: access to one of Vanderbilt's new steamboats for his Hudson River operations. While they had once been rivals, they had, at least for the time, transformed it into an uneasy partnership, each respecting the other's ruthlessness while never fully trusting one another. Vanderbilt faced renewed competition on his Boston to Maine steamboat route, responding with fierce public anti-monopoly rhetoric. By now, his reputation alone often intimidated rivals into paying him off instead of competing. The transportation company, for instance, purchased Vanderbilt's Lexington steamer for $60,000 plus a $10,000 bonus, well above its real value, just to remove it from competition. Vanderbilt skillfully recouped his investment while shifting his focus to railroads. Unlike steamboats, the Commodore couldn't easily compete with railways, so he needed a new strategy. In 1840, when the struggling Stonington Railroad sought Vanderbilt's help, he cryptically remarked, "If I owned the road, I'd know how to make it profitable." Though initially dismissed, Vanderbilt quietly joined the Long Island Railroad Board, redirecting business away from the Stonington. Shareholders panicked at the high debt and reduced traffic. Its stock plummeted, allowing Vanderbilt and his allies, including Drew, to secretly acquire a controlling share. By 1847, Vanderbilt became president of the Stonington, the first stop toward railroad dominance. By 1848, Vanderbilt had firmly established his transportation empire, becoming the monopoly he once opposed. Though his methods contradicted his anti-monopoly rhetoric, Vanderbilt democratized transportation, forever transforming the industry, and he was only just beginning. In early 1848, far from Vanderbilt's bustling New York, two men carried gold nuggets into an adobe building in California, triggering one of history's greatest economic frenzies, the California Gold Rush. Vanderbilt's eye was always drawn to major transportation routes. Now, watching tens of thousands head to San Francisco each month, he saw a bigger opportunity than anything he'd tackled before. This is why the Commodore went to see Secretary of State John M. Clayton with Joseph L. White, a former politician who knew his way around Washington. Vanderbilt explained the situation clearly. Without a transcontinental railroad, only a fraction of the Americans and European immigrants rushing west could travel by covered wagon. The overland route was dangerous, passing through hostile Native American territories and treacherous mountain ranges, often taking up to 6 months. Hundreds died annually from accidents, exposure, starvation, or attacks. The alternative, sailing around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, was faster. Roughly 90 days, but expensive at around $600 per passenger in the lowest class. "I can improve on that," Vanderbilt told Clayton. "I can make money at $300 by crossing through Nicaragua." But Vanderbilt wasn't primarily after passengers. He wanted the lucrative U.S. mail contracts. Vanderbilt proposed to Clayton exclusive rights from the Nicaraguan government to build a canal. In the meantime, he planned to operate steamships from New York to Nicaragua and onward to San Francisco. Passengers would travel up the San Juan River, cross Lake Nicaragua by steamship, and then journey the remaining 12 miles by mule. Clayton favored Vanderbilt's proposal, as an American-built canal would exclude British interests and expand American influence. White successfully secured an initial contract from Nicaragua, but the company soon faced controversy when Britain protested, asserting control over strategic points in Nicaragua. Despite a British blockade and international crisis, Vanderbilt pressed forward, commissioning new ships, including the Prometheus, at 1,200 tons, the largest and fastest of its kind at the time. In 1850, Vanderbilt traveled to London to secure critical British financing, only to find the financial elite skeptical about the ambitious canal project. Matters worsened when a scathing press report accused Vanderbilt's enterprise of being an experiment in which a few lawyers in Wall Street were the principal movers, their original purpose being to obtain a charter and afterwards dispose of it at any good price. It was a low point in Vanderbilt's career. Seen as a fraud, he became determined to prove his critics wrong. In late 1850, undaunted by setbacks in London, Vanderbilt shifted his focus from a challenging canal project toward a practical transportation route across Nicaragua. Unlike the canal enterprise, which depended on numerous investors for the large capital project, his new steamship line was his personal venture. The Prometheus became the first ocean-going steamship entirely owned by one man. Vanderbilt's assistant recalled, "When she started out, there was not a cent owing on her, he remarking that he wanted her to go out on her own bottom." In December 1850, Vanderbilt, now 57, boarded the Prometheus for his first of 3 crucial voyages to Nicaragua. His journey was so secretive, due to fears of alerting rivals, that even his wife didn't know his whereabouts. Upon arrival, Vanderbilt found troubling news. His captain in Nicaragua, Colonel David White, reported the steamer Oris wrecked on the rapids of the San Juan River, deeming the rapids impassable. White's repeated attempts with another steamer, the director, failed. Vanderbilt refused to accept defeat, declaring, "I'm going up to the lake without any more fooling." Taking command himself, he pushed the little steamer through the rapids with brute force, defying his engineers' warnings. Returning triumphantly to New York, Vanderbilt boasted of the Prometheus's unmatched speed and fuel efficiency. Ever the showman, he even offered a $100,000 wager that no existing ship could surpass its performance. His innovative walking beam engine design, contrary to conventional wisdom, proved more efficient and lighter than competitors' side lever engines. Despite significant challenges, George Law's rival Panama route, British interference, and Nicaraguan political instability, Vanderbilt established the Accessory Transit Company in summer 1851. His Nicaragua transit route rapidly gained popularity thanks to his aggressive improvements, competitive pricing, and sheer determination. He overcame logistical hurdles by building specialized riverboats, blasting through rapids, constructing a plank road, and adding more ocean-going ships. Vanderbilt's Nicaragua venture shows his remarkable ability to execute complex operations before modern communications and management systems existed. Remember that this was over 170 years ago, and he was coordinating ocean-going vessels, river steamboats, and overland transportation across multiple countries, dealing with foreign governments and international rivals, all without telephones, computers, or even telegraphs to much of his operation. It's a reminder of how much business success in this era depended on judgment, foresight, and an almost intuitive understanding of logistics. In November 1851, Vanderbilt's third Nicaragua voyage nearly ended disastrously when a British warship fired warning shots, forcing him to pay a port fee. The incident triggered a diplomatic crisis, resulting in a formal apology from London. Once labeled a fraud, Vanderbilt was now hailed by the press, which praised his indomitable resolution. Not just known for being rich, Vanderbilt was now becoming an international sensation. By 1852, Vanderbilt's Nicaraguan shipping route exploded with profits. After a shipwreck near Mexico exposed his cold focus on revenue over rescue, tensions grew when his ex-partner, Joseph White, faked British financing. Vanderbilt retaliated. He drove down Accessory Transit stock, snapped it up cheap, then sold his fleet for $1.35 million, trapping short sellers and making a fortune. Sensing his own mortality, the Commodore decided on a rare vacation in Europe, leaving trusted associates in charge. Little did he know betrayal awaited while he was gone. He had never taken a vacation before, and he'd never take one again. His yacht, the North Star, was the largest and most luxurious private vessel of its time, built at Vanderbilt's own shipyard. At 270 feet and 2,500 tons with twin walking beam engines of his own design, it featured opulent interiors decorated with rosewood furniture, marble paneling, lace curtains, and ceilings adorned with paintings of American heroes. Vanderbilt's motivations for the voyage were multifaceted. After decades of relentless work, he genuinely wanted a vacation. He also sought to repair strained family relationships by inviting extended family members. Additionally, he viewed the trip as a chance to showcase American engineering prowess abroad, as he told Senator Hamilton Fish, "I have a little pride as an American to sail over the waters of England and France with such a vessel as will give credit to the enterprise of our country." Before departing, Vanderbilt carefully arranged his affairs. He removed Joseph White and his allies from the Accessory Transit Company's board, replacing them with trusted associates including Nelson Robinson and Charles Morgan. However, while Vanderbilt toured Europe receiving widespread acclaim, betrayal was brewing at home. Charles Morgan, whom Vanderbilt himself had appointed to the Accessory Transit Board, secretly began buying up shares and aligned with Vanderbilt's old enemy, Joseph White. In July 1853, they staged a coup, electing themselves directors and removing Vanderbilt as the company's agent, cutting off his lucrative commissions by falsely claiming Vanderbilt was indebted to the company. When Vanderbilt returned to New York in September 1853 aboard the North Star, he discovered the betrayal. The Herald had already reported Morgan and White's actions, noting ominously, "Trouble is anticipated upon the return of Commodore Vanderbilt." This betrayal allegedly produced what has become one of the most famous letters in American business history. Now listen to this. Upon learning of Morgan and White's treachery, Vanderbilt supposedly penned these immortal words, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you. Yours truly, Cornelius Vanderbilt." The letter, perfectly capturing Vanderbilt's fierce reputation, bias toward action, and blunt style, is likely apocryphal. Historians point out it first appeared decades later in Vanderbilt's obituary without evidence, and the language used doesn't match Vanderbilt's usual correspondence. True or false, it captured the essence of the man. Vanderbilt, known for frequent litigation since 1816, immediately filed lawsuits against Morgan and White, contradicting the letter's claim that he would not sue. The letter may be myth, but Vanderbilt's actual response was no less dramatic. He fired off a blistering public letter to James Gordon Bennett, editor of the Herald, denouncing the cowardice which, in my absence in a foreign country, dictated the calumnious statement, and calling it utterly false that he owed the company money. Far from eschewing legal action, he concluded with this warning, "My rights against the company will be determined in due time by the judgment of the legal tribunals." When Morgan suggested arbitration but failed to follow through, Vanderbilt escalated his retaliation with financial warfare. On January 5th, 1854, he began aggressively short-selling accessory transit stock, selling thousands of shares he didn't own at $25, betting prices would collapse. Morgan, recognizing the threat, desperately bought stock to maintain its price. The New York Times described the clash as a fierce contest of bull and bear, pitting two seasoned, wealthy financiers against each other in a ruthless battle for control. Vanderbilt doesn't want to win, he wants to dominate. 12 days later, Vanderbilt sprung his trap. "New line of steamships to San Francisco," announced the Times. While Morgan was busy buying transit stock, Vanderbilt had been secretly refitting his luxury private yacht, the North Star, as a passenger liner to compete directly with Accessory Transit. And of course, when he put it on the market, the resulting fare war was unprecedented. Vanderbilt undercut the transit fare, slashing the price to less than a third of the going rate. Passengers flocked to what became known as the independent line, though conditions reflected the ruthless cost-cutting. The bloodletting extended beyond Morgan and White. Pacific Mail and U.S. Mail steamship companies, which had long dominated the California route, saw their revenues collapse as they tried to match Vanderbilt's prices. All companies were hemorrhaging money, even Vanderbilt. One of his partners who had come in on the business with him actually went bankrupt, but Vanderbilt could take more pain than anyone else. By August 1854, Morgan and his allies capitulated. They purchased Vanderbilt's steamships for $800,000, price far exceeding their original cost. Accessory Transit agreed to pay Vanderbilt an additional $115,000 for his claims of every sort. The companies quickly restored fares to their previous high levels: $300 for first cabin, $250 for second, and $150 for steerage. But those who knew Vanderbilt's history remained skeptical of his promise to stay away from the California trade. After signing, Morgan and his allies breathed a sigh of relief. It was over, or so they thought. In reality, it was just beginning. In November 1855, Cornelius Vanderbilt orchestrated a stunning financial coup. While Morgan and his allies thought the battle was over, the Commodore was buying his way back in and doing it at a discount. Only, typical to him, people didn't yet know it was him. Wall Street buzzed with news that mysterious brokers were accumulating quantities of transit stock, 25,000 shares, nearly a third of all shares in existence. Behind this movement, as such operations were called at the time, stood Vanderbilt and two unlikely allies, Marshall Roberts of the U.S. Mail Steamship and William Aspinwall of Pacific Mail. These titans of shipping, men who considered themselves Vanderbilt's social superiors, had decided to place their fortunes in his hand. Their plan was audacious: acquire Accessory Transit, get rid of Morgan and his allies, use Vanderbilt's cost-cutting expertise to make it profitable again, then consolidate it with U.S. Mail and create a monopoly over all passenger traffic between New York and California. Roberts and Aspinwall would pocket millions, while Vanderbilt would rule the most vital transportation corridor in America. The Commodore, who less than 9 months earlier had publicly proclaimed his belief in unfettered trade and unrestrained competition, was now plotting to establish the very monopoly he claimed to despise. And it's not like he was telling people what he was going to do. He was doing it through obfuscation, through silence, and misdirection. Little did he know that 3,500 miles away, a small man with intense gray eyes was about to upend everything. On November 8th, soldiers executed General Corral, a respected military commander, in the central plaza of Granada, Nicaragua. The man behind his death was William Walker, a slight, freckle-faced American whose penetrating gray eyes captivated everyone he met. Though he looked more like a priest than a revolutionary, Walker had just seized control of Nicaragua. Walker was a filibuster, not in the parliamentary sense of the word. He was a private citizen leading armed invasions of foreign lands under the guise of patriotic expansion. Born in Nashville and trained as a doctor and lawyer, he previously led a failed invasion of Mexico. Undeterred, Walker arrived in Nicaragua in 1855 with only 56 men, initially hired as mercenaries to fight for the liberal faction in Nicaragua's civil war. His victory hinged on one brilliant maneuver: commandeering an accessory transit steamboat on Lake Nicaragua and capturing the conservative stronghold at Granada from behind. By taking prominent conservative families hostage, Walker forced General Corral into surrender. Walker established a puppet government headed by Patricio Rivas, a weak leader he easily controlled. Shortly after, Walker accused Corral of treason, orchestrated a quick trial by his own men, and executed him publicly, consolidating his power. Yet Walker knew his survival depended on reinforcements from the United States, making him dangerously reliant on Vanderbilt's Accessory Transit Company, a company Vanderbilt was determined to reclaim. Walker's initial attempts to negotiate with transit executives Joseph White and Cornelius Garrison failed. Enter Edmund Randolph, a Virginia aristocrat and friend of Walker who proposed a daring conspiracy to Cornelius Garrison, Transit's San Francisco agent. Randolph intended to revoke the existing charter and grant a new charter to himself, cutting Vanderbilt out entirely. After initial hesitation, Garrison sent his son William to Nicaragua to secure Walker's agreement. Walker enthusiastically accepted Randolph's scheme, providing legal justification for canceling Transit's charter. By late December, Walker awarded the new transit rights to Randolph, who immediately sold them to Garrison and Morgan. In return, they promised transports Walker reinforcements at no cost. Meanwhile, Vanderbilt continued buying Accessory Transit stock, oblivious to the conspiracy forming behind him. Walker represented a threat Vanderbilt had never faced, someone wielding an armed force behind the reach of Vanderbilt's usual tactics of financial warfare or intimidation. Vanderbilt was forced to enter the dangerous realm of international intrigue. Sylvanus Spencer, a sailor known for his toughness and intimate knowledge of Nicaragua's transit routes, became Vanderbilt's unlikely hero. Armed with Vanderbilt's backing and $40,000, Spencer traveled to Costa Rica and convinced President Juan Rafael Mora to help sever Walker's supply lines. On December 23, 1856, Spencer's troops silently overtook the filibuster garrison at Hips Point and captured Walker's steamboats one by one, using Spencer's expert knowledge to avoid suspicion. Spencer's campaign culminated at San Carlos, a strategic fortress where he secured a bloodless surrender, crippling Walker's supply lines. With his resources cut off, Walker's position rapidly deteriorated. Following a prolonged siege, Walker surrendered on May 1, 1857, and was safely escorted from Nicaragua. But Walker didn't abandon his ambitions. In November, he attempted another invasion but was swiftly captured and forced to surrender by the U.S. Navy. His final expedition ended tragically when the British forces captured him and delivered him to the Honduran authorities, who executed him by firing squad on September 12, 1860. Vanderbilt's enemies fell one by one. After breaking Walker, he turned his focus to exacting revenge on Garrison and Morgan. When Garrison faced arrest in New York for alleged frauds exceeding $500,000 during his tenure as transit company agent, he attempted reconciliation with Vanderbilt. Visiting Vanderbilt, Garrison proposed collaborating on the Walker grant. Vanderbilt sternly refused, emphasizing his actions were solely for the benefit of transit company and its shareholders, not for personal gain. Simultaneously, Vanderbilt intensified his dominance of the California steamship traffic and boldly targeted the Atlantic shipping lanes. On December 10, 1855, thousands watched at Simpson's shipyard as Vanderbilt launched the largest steamship of its era, aptly named the Vanderbilt. At 335 feet long, with a massive 42-foot diameter side wheels and 5 decks, it cost over $900,000, a clear demonstration of Vanderbilt's wealth and determination to defeat the heavily subsidized Collin and Cunard lines. The Vanderbilt's maiden voyage in May 1857 was a stunning success, reaching England in record time. Newspapers lauded its unprecedented speed and luxury, prompting Vanderbilt to aggressively cut fares and strategically timed departures to undermine competitors. By 1860, this strategy had dismantled the Collins line, forcing it to sell off its ships. In 1860, Vanderbilt also achieved total control of the California steamship traffic through an agreement with William Aspinwall, dividing the business between Vanderbilt's Atlantic and Pacific Steamship Company on the Atlantic side and Pacific Mail on the Pacific side. Despite years spent dismantling monopolies through fierce competition, Vanderbilt pragmatically created his own monopoly once victorious, stabilizing fares and securing consistent profits. Vanderbilt's influence was so immense that when the California postal contract ended in 1860, he boldly refused to carry the mail, threatening communication between coasts. This prompted President Buchanan's personal intervention, promising Vanderbilt retroactive payment from Congress to maintain essential services. Even as Vanderbilt dominated ocean transportation, he began extending his reach into railroads. His involvement with the New York and Harlem Railroad began in 1857 when he joined its board alongside his son-in-law, Horace Clark, and financier Daniel Drew. The company faced bankruptcy with large debts due amid the panic of 1857. Vanderbilt's code of honor distinguished him in a crisis. When Drew refused to endorse the renewal of the railroad's notes despite having accepted a commission, Vanderbilt confronted him directly. "Mr. Drew," Vanderbilt declared, "are you going to sign all these acceptances?" "Not one of them," Drew objected. "Are you crazy?" "I'm going to sign all these and you are too," Vanderbilt insisted. "Where's the money to come from to pay for it?" Drew asked. "You and I will pay for it if no one else does," Vanderbilt replied firmly. "I'll do it if it takes the coat off my back. I always honor my commitments." Drew eventually signed, nearly in tears. Vanderbilt later recounted with satisfaction, "He did not dare cheat me." This incident highlighted Vanderbilt's growing authority and strict adherence to business commitments, qualities that would prove vital as he expanded further into railroads. Drew would soon want revenge, but for the moment, he waited. By 1860, Vanderbilt had achieved immense influence, described by the Chicago Tribune as almost knightly power. He controlled the Atlantic steamship traffic. He was the largest shareholder in Pacific Mail and held prominent positions in New York's Harlem and Erie railroads. His estimated wealth of around 11 million likely made him America's richest private citizen. Vanderbilt represented something new in American business, a man whose wealth and power transcended the categories of the past. Beyond historical analysis, men followed this demanding, profane titan out of genuine respect. When Captain Ludlow of the Ariel died at sea during a fierce storm in December 1859, his final words were, "Tell the Commodore I died at the post of duty." This loyalty reflected Vanderbilt's core qualities. No one understood steamships better, took greater personal risks, or was more committed to keeping his word. As America entered the turbulent 1860s, Vanderbilt stood unmatched in power. He was hated, admired, resented, yet always respected, even by his enemies. As Cornelius Vanderbilt approached 70 in 1864, most men his age were considering retirement. Vanderbilt, however, was not most men. He's an outlier, and he was planning his greatest conquest yet. After decades dominating American waterways, the Commodore was now transforming himself into the railroad king. The stakes were immense. In an era before automobiles, highways, or air travel, railroads were essential to American commerce. The rail network represented far more than transportation. It was, according to a contemporary observer, the most tremendous and far-reaching engine of social revolution which has ever either blessed or cursed the earth. Just as steamboats had reshaped America decades earlier, railways now dramatically altered geography, economy, and society. Cities like Chicago grew exponentially, increasing from 43,000 people in 1850 to 400,000 people by 1870, driven primarily by its role as a railway hub. Vanderbilt's ambition was clear: to dominate the most critical rail corridor in America. Vanderbilt's railroad empire began with his purchase of the struggling New York and Harlem Railroad in 1863, a small line critics dismissed as only good for wrapping paper. Vanderbilt, however, saw potential where others saw failure, aiming to create the only direct rail connection between New York City and the industrial heartland of New England. Driven by pride and a relentless pursuit of efficiency, Vanderbilt acquired the Hudson River Railroad in 1864, securing control over the only railways entering Manhattan. Yet, this is merely the starting point. To access the lucrative Midwest markets, Vanderbilt needed cooperation from New York Central Railroad, a major trunk line running from Albany to Buffalo. For 3 years, Vanderbilt patiently negotiated with the Central's presidents, Ernest Corning and then Dean Richmond. Frustrated by the Central's practice of diverting his rail cars to competing steamboat lines, Vanderbilt repeatedly voiced his complaints. Though Vanderbilt preferred diplomacy to confrontation, a proposed merger between the railroads faced strong opposition. His lieutenant, Horace Clark, warned that such a move would shake the state to its center, appearing as an attempt to strengthen railroad monopolies. In August 1866, the landscape changed suddenly when Richmond died. Henry Keep, the Central's new president, was a secret strategic thinker, openly hostile to Vanderbilt. Keep vowed privately to take revenge against Vanderbilt, even if it cost him half his wealth. The breaking point came in December 1866, when Keep abruptly revoked a hard-fought agreement to pay the Hudson $100,000 annually for handling the New York Central traffic into New York City. So on December 29th, Vanderbilt met with Keep and his allies. William Vanderbilt repeatedly questioned Keep, asking, "Gentlemen, you have repudiated our contracts and disrupted our established agreement. Do you have any alternative to propose?" Keep responded coldly, offering only minimal compensation. After 5 hours of fruitless discussion, Vanderbilt drove Corning, a more reasonable Central director, to his hotel. "Mr. Corning, I'm very sorry we cannot get along together in this manner," Vanderbilt remarked. "I am too," Corning replied. "If it was left to just you and me, we could fix it in a little while." "I believe we could," the Commodore agreed. But this brief exchange clarified for Vanderbilt that Corning had no real authority. Keep held all the power, making further negotiations pointless. Soon after, Vanderbilt unleashed his most powerful weapon. On January 14, 1867, the boards of the Hudson River and Harlem Railroads voted to sever all ties with the New York Central Railroad. They refused to accept any tickets or freight from the Central and halted all train crossings over the Albany Bridge. This decision amounted to a declaration of economic war with immediate and severe consequences. It would place the New York Central Railroad in a position where it could no longer claim to be a primary trunk line between New York and Buffalo, explained William Vanderbilt. Amid a fierce snowstorm that paralyzed New York State, passengers were forced to cross the frozen Hudson River at Albany on foot or hire sleighs for transportation. Freight shipments from the west piled up, and alternative railroad connections dependent on unreliable ferry crossings due to severe weather failed to meet the demand. Effectively, what's happened here is Vanderbilt has isolated New York City from the rest of the world. He literally controls the ingress and egress through railroad lines, and he's said no. The Brooklyn Eagle accused Vanderbilt of placing the city under strict blockade, describing his actions as criminal and deserving exemplary punishment. When called before a legislative committee, Vanderbilt bluntly defended himself. When you talk about legally, I suppose your next question will be, why didn't you prosecute them? It is not according to my mode of doing things to bring a suit against a man that I have the power in my own hands to punish. The law, as I view it, goes too slow for me when I have the remedy in my own hands. This was a striking display of private power overriding public interest. One man's ability to disrupt a major city's commerce for personal corporate objectives. If you were to judge this solely on its effectiveness, then you would conclude it worked, and it worked quickly. Keep quickly capitulated. On January 17th, he urgently telegraphed Corning what is to be done. He handed full authority to settle the dispute to Corning and two other directors more inclined towards compromise. The trio promptly visited Vanderbilt's office to negotiate peace. One director later acknowledged that Vanderbilt was the most eager to resolve the situation. On January 19th, a new agreement was finalized. The Central Railroad promised to deliver as much freight to the Hudson River Railroad as it received from them, ensuring no more empty cars returned from Albany. It also agreed to cover a portion of the terminal expenses. Keep was publicly humiliated. John M. Davidson wrote to Corning that Keep and Lockwood are large sellers. They flooded the market with stock. The swearing against Keep by the stockholders is intense. They're considering a meeting to demand his resignation. So basically, Keep gets outmaneuvered by Vanderbilt. He dumps the shares. Davidson is telling us that Keep and Lockwood are both just flooding the market with their shares. So the share price is sinking. What Davidson did not yet realize, but Vanderbilt clearly saw, was the exceptional opportunity the crisis presented. As Keep and his partner dump their shares, Vanderbilt starts acquiring them. This marked a decisive shift in his tactics. After 3 years of diplomacy, he now aggressively moved to secure ownership, taking advantage of Keep's weakening position. By the Central's annual meeting in December 1867, Vanderbilt had acquired enough stock to seize control. His allies, including William Clark and Shell, were elected to the board. Keep's presidency ended, and when Corning nominated Vanderbilt as president, the outcome was inevitable. In just 4 years, Vanderbilt had progressed from controlling the modest Harlem Railroad to dominating one of America's major rail networks. The event underscores a critical lesson about leverage and power. Keep had mistakenly believed that his title as president granted him control, but Vanderbilt understood that true power came from ownership. Titles alone didn't guarantee authority. CEOs holding little equity can be removed by boards or investors, whereas those with controlling stakes can dictate strategy and vision despite opposition. I just want to recap here for a second. So Keep and Vanderbilt get into this fight. So Vanderbilt effectively humiliates Keep. Keep dumps the shares because he knows he's getting ousted. So he starts dumping all his shares. Then Vanderbilt buys the shares. So the shares at depressed prices. So he effectively causes the share price to lower and then buys the shares and takes control. This isn't the first time he used this playbook. So, with control of both the Hudson River and New York Central railroads, Vanderbilt revived his earlier proposal for consolidation. Persistent conflicts between these interconnected lines had proven impossible to resolve through contractual agreements alone. A merger would align their interests and eliminate structural inefficiencies. So in 1869, Vanderbilt successfully secured legislation permitting the merger. The resulting New York Central and Hudson River Railroad was among America's largest enterprises, boasting a capitalization of approximately $90 million and dominating the crucial transportation corridor from New York to Buffalo. This consolidation represented more than just another business transaction. It marked a fundamental transformation of American capitalism. Vanderbilt helped pioneer the concept of the giant corporation, distinct from the individual ownership or management. By merging older railroad companies into a single entity focused on efficiency and profitability, he also shifted their original public service missions. The concentration of economic power raised concerns. It's not a pleasant reflection, wrote Harper's Weekly, that the great thoroughfare between the East and the West is in the hands of the Vanderbilt family. Despite these anxieties, Vanderbilt's consolidation brought clear economic advantages. Resolving conflicts between the Central and Hudson River lines reduced delays, simplified operations, and significantly lowered costs. By 1870, Cornelius Vanderbilt had fundamentally reshaped American business. In just 4 years, he transformed himself from the commodore of the waterways into the railroad king, building one of America's most significant business empires. Vanderbilt's railroad consolidation mirrored broader economic trends, the emergence of large corporate enterprises, increasingly abstract ownership structures, and concentrated economic power. He demonstrated both the benefits and the risks of this new corporate model. His railroad empire achieved economies of scale that lowered transportation costs and boosted economic growth. However, his blockade of New York raised troubling concerns about the extent of private influence within a democratic society. As Vanderbilt, now 75, surveyed his empire, he saw a nation transformed, not merely by railroads, but by the corporate structures he pioneered to build and manage them. William Lloyd Garrison had envisioned that improved communication and connections would unify societies, promoting common values and shared prosperity. Vanderbilt indeed united distant regions with iron rails, but the legacy of his work was not democracy or equality. It was the modern corporation itself. A statue of Cornelius Vanderbilt stands at the entrance of New York City's Grand Central Terminal overlooking Park Avenue South and the empire that he created. The infrastructure he built remains essential, even as the original corporation and dynasty he established has faded. Yet, as Vanderbilt's railroad directors noted after his death, this work will go on, though the master workman is gone. Cornelius Vanderbilt is often portrayed as a ruthless robber baron, but the reality is more nuanced. He embodied fascinating contradictions, a fierce competitor who preferred diplomacy, a tough negotiator who carefully balanced aggression with patience. His railroad empire, consolidating the Harlem, Hudson River, and New York Central railroads, was built only after repeated attempts at peaceful negotiation failed. Vanderbilt's mergers produced a corporate giant from Manhattan to Lake Erie, ushering in bureaucracy, delegation, and unprecedented efficiency. By his death, he reportedly held 1/9 or 1/20th, depending on how you counted, of all U.S. currency, sparking debate over his wealth, democracy, and the unsettling power of massive corporations. America had entered its era of great fortunes, and Vanderbilt had led the way. Vanderbilt's legacy is nearly entirely heroic nor villainous, but reflects America's shift from rural merchants and farmers to corporate industrialism. He was an individualist who built institutions, a practical navigator who pioneered an abstract economy. He was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. His relentless drive and continual reinvention defined not just his life, but also the nation's transition into modern times. As his railroad directors aptly summarized, Vanderbilt's greatest monument was the lasting framework he established. The work will go on, though the master workman is gone. All right, I want to cover a few reflections before we get into the lessons that you can take away from this. This guy is such a badass. He's done so many things. So there's so many points in this story. Like, this is a skeleton of his life. We missed a whole bunch of things. I'm going to tell you a few of them, but each of these things could be their own episodes. Like each of these little battles on the seas, or the Nicaragua thing, or the railroad battles. Like, this is crazy. We didn't even cover the Erie battle with Jay Gould, and Daniel Drew comes back for that one. And we just didn't have time because I want to keep these reasonably short. So we'll cover some of this more in the future, but I wanted to give you a sketch of the person and some of the things you can learn from him. Now, we didn't have time to get into this either, but Vanderbilt was not a role model as a parent or partner. I mean, he applied a lot of the same tactics that he championed in business, he applied at home, and they had a much different result. Instead of leading to success, it led to disaster. Another fascinating angle to this that we'll maybe cover in another episode in the future is how his heirs managed to squander the world's largest fortune in only a few generations. It's a story that involves New York society, royalty, lavish parties, wives trying to one-up each other, legal battles, and so much more. Interestingly, Anderson Cooper wrote a book on this, and he would know because he is, after all, a Vanderbilt. You can take your learning to the next level for these two. Like, one of the things that people email me and they're like, what book did you use? So we highlight the books we used. For this, it was Tycoon's War, and we used the first Tycoon. We also put my highlights into the repository that you can access. So if you're a member at Farnham Street, if you go to fs.blog/membership, you can actually search all my highlights from all the books and all the episodes and see what I underlined when I was reading the book. Okay, I want to get into some of the lessons that we can take away from Vanderbilt and how we can use them and maybe apply them in life. So the first lesson is ride the wave. When a better technology came along, Vanderbilt jumped on it. He went from ferries to steamships to railroads without trying to cling to the past. The guy did not think about sunk costs. He went all in, and I admire that about him. A lot of people would have been trying to sort of walk that line between both, but not Vanderbilt. He went all in. 2, patience. He didn't need quick wins. He wasn't looking for validation from other people. He'd rather take a temporary loss if it meant owning the market later. He would always do what was in the long-term interests of himself and not the short-term interests. Which leads me to 3, which is his ability to take pain. Physical pain from powering through blizzards when no other ferry captain would. Financial pain from slashing prices to zero profit and sometimes at a loss just to drive out rivals. Psychological pain, threatening to block rail traffic to and from New York City and then doing it. And he survived all these scenarios and crushed everyone else. The man could take more pain than almost anybody I've studied. 4, control. Vanderbilt wasn't really interested in being a passive shareholder. He wanted control or nothing. He didn't want to sit on the sidelines and watch somebody else do it. He wanted to lead. 5, showmanship. It's easy to root for the underdog, and Vanderbilt often positioned himself that way against a big monopoly. Then once he beat them, he essentially became the monopoly. But by that point, he already had public sympathy on his side. And he was also a bit of a showman, too, whether racing steamboats or blocking the rails. He made business feel like high drama. And that's part of why his legend endures today. He was always the talk of the town, even when he was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. 6, go all in. If you crossed Vanderbilt, it wasn't enough for him to beat you. He wanted to finish you, financially or otherwise. He didn't just win, he dominated. 7, positioning. Vanderbilt operated with very little leverage, so he could always take advantage of his rivals' misfortunes. He also would cause poor positioning in other people. He knew when people were selling or buying, he would often force them to sell, and he would short the stock. They would sell, it would drive down the price, and then he'd buy it back, and he'd either take control. He was always in a position to capitalize on the circumstances that forced other people into bad hands. 8, move in silence. Yes, he might say, I'm going to ruin you, but he rarely telegraphed how he'd do it. He made clandestine stock purchases, he turned enemies into allies, and he pulled off secret deals. By the time rivals realized, it was too late. 9, make money. Vanderbilt made money in many ways. It reminds me of a quote by John D. Rockefeller who said, I have ways of making money that you know nothing of. Vanderbilt made money on competing. He made money from not competing. He made money from monopolizing, And he understood where the real money was, like the lucrative mail contracts from New York to San Francisco. And that's the lessons you can take away from this. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time. Thanks for listening and learning with us. For a complete list of episodes, show notes, transcripts, and more, go to fs.blog/podcast or just Google The Knowledge Project. The Farnham Street blog is also where you can learn more about my new book, Clear Thinking, Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. It's a transformative guide that hands you the tools to master your fate, sharpen your decision-making, and set yourself up for unparalleled success. Learn more at fs.blog/clear. Until next time.